Okay, so I'd like to now begin a discussion of one of the most important concepts for this course, for the discipline of sociology, and I would argue just for the human experience in general. The sociological imagination is, um, a tool, in fact, for kind of cultivating empathy, compassion, understanding for others, for those around us, and potentially a way to reframe our own lives and kind of understand the way that society affects our lives, our opportunities, and the quality of our lived experience in general. So I'm going to go ahead and start here with a quote by C. Wright Mills, who's pictured here on the right side of the lecture slide that you can see. And the quote is from C. Wright Mills' book published in 1959 called The Sociological Imagination. And you can see here the quote. I'll let you read through that while I state it out loud. So, neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. And I really like this quote because it kind of encapsulates the main idea of the sociological imagination. It also gets at the aspect of the sociological imagination which kind of underscores the interplay between the individual and society. So the first part, neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. It's quite interesting to think about how this quotation is saying that we can't really understand our own lives unless we understand the history of society, and of course we can't really understand the history of society unless we understand the kind of individual narratives that make up that history. So I think that this quote is quite instructive and helps us frame our exploration and analysis of the sociological imagination as a broader concept. So a few more kind of basic ideas included within the sociological imagination. Are listed here. So the first one, the intersection of biography and history. I mentioned this dynamic previously. The sociological imagination is a tool that we can use to really explore the way that our own personal lived experience, our own personal narrative, which is biography, kind of affects history, which is the social, the structural context within which we exist. But also this word intersection implies that there is a kind of interplay between these two, we might call them variables. And it's also suggesting that history, right, is influencing biography or our own personal narrative. The next component is that the sociological imagination allows its possessor to kind of grasp the structural basis for personal problems. Now, C. Wright Mills uses this kind of typology, private troubles and public issues, to illustrate some of the differences there. But the basic idea here is that many of us, in fact, most of us, no matter where we were raised, which culture kind of we were brought up within, are socialized to view our problems as personal and as individualistic, and not necessarily as the result of social phenomena or social structure. So the sociological imagination allows us to examine the structural basis. Now, I do want to be careful with this idea. The sociological imagination is not a concept that is stating individuals have no personal responsibility, that our entire life is determined by society, and that individual outcomes are completely the result of social phenomenon. This is certainly not the case. Mills acknowledged that personal responsibility, that agency, are important determinants, essentially, of outcomes within an individual's life. But the emphasis here is on the structural basis. So often we are so aggressively socialized into individualistic thinking that we fail really to examine the structural basis for our personal problems. If we are overweight, maybe obese, we often blame ourselves. It's our eating habits, it's our lack of exercising, and of course the solution to that problem is to change those individual habits. So getting towards the third point, how much control can one exercise over the challenges they experience? If we are looking at obesity again, and we're viewing obesity as a private trouble, as a personal problem that doesn't have much to do with society, then the individual solutions lie within, the range of the individual, to use C. Wright Mills' own language. If we're viewing obesity as a private trouble, it's something that we can change or modify or alleviate through individual action. But of course, if we see obesity or being overweight as part of kind of a larger systemic framework, say as a result of a lack of access to healthy foods, as a result of living in a food desert, which is a geographic location that is kind of bereft of fresh produce and unprocessed food. If we look at availability of safe space to exercise or the cost of gym memberships, we could then even zoom out further and look at societal standards of beauty, look at food marketing, and look at all of these other dynamics, social dynamics that in fact influence obesity. Then we are activating our sociological imagination, and we're beginning to view obesity as a public issue as opposed to a private trouble. So to do one more example here, of course I did obesity on the previous slide. To do a more explicit example, a kind of classic example using a sociological imagination, I'll discuss unemployment. This is particularly topical. I use this example every quarter, but unfortunately today, as I'm speaking, unemployment rates are higher than they have potentially ever been. The official data says that unemployment is still lower than it was in the depths of the Great Depression, where unemployment rates hit above 20%. But some estimates do put unemployment today, in the context of the COVID-19 crisis pandemic, between 15 and 20%, and they could potentially rise further. So unemployment is something that many people are experiencing. Now, of course, traditionally, we might view unemployment as a private trouble, as a result of kind of a lack of individual action, individual being too lazy, staying home playing video games all day, no discipline, or some other personal flaw. In order to address that private trouble, the solution would be found within the range of individual action. So, this would mean an individual would start submitting job applications, go out, look for jobs, begin networking. All they have to do is essentially modify behavior. And the private trouble analysis is particularly effective when we are looking at small groups of people that are affected or potentially individuals. So if we saw that unemployment rates were very low, maybe below 3%, 4%, something like that, then we might be looking at individuals as responsible for their unemployment. But when unemployment rates are quite high, it might be actually more productive to use a public issues analysis, where we start to look at the structural opportunities for employment. Currently, there are millions of Americans filing new unemployment claims each week. They've lost their job as a result of a structural breakdown. This is no one's individual fault. You can't tell someone who lost their job at a restaurant because of a statewide mandate to close non-essential businesses as being responsible for their own unemployment. Now, of course, we could look at preparation and whether or not they went out to seek higher education and all of those things, and we could use a sociological imagination to analyze some of those kind of say upstream causes potentially, but often we would find that public issues analysis is still more effective. So if we're looking at unemployment that's affecting large numbers of people like it is today, or during the Great Depression or after the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, we need systemic solutions. So that could be a federal jobs program, that could be expanded benefits, expanded access to higher education, retraining programs. Whatever they are, the solutions are systemic, they're structural. They're not individual solutions. Of course, the solution might affect individuals, but the solution is not individual behavioral modification.